The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
My name is Julia Rist. I'm a reporter for the NPR affiliate station WFUV, located on the Rose Hill campus of Fordham University. Twice a year, WFUV works with Norwood News and BronxNet Television to delve into important issues in a project we call Bronx Connections. Our past initiatives looked into development issues and food insecurity. Our latest collaboration is called the Bronx Gang Impact. This past summer, 15-year-old Alessandro Jr. Guzman Feliz was killed by a group of Trinitarios. They're one of the gangs in the Bronx. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity, but it prompted a swift outcry from the community and nationwide about gang violence. In the next half hour, we'll get a better understanding of gang activity in the Bronx and how the community is responding to it. We'll cover topics such as violence interrupters, gangs in schools, and how gang members use social media. Our guests with me today are some of the reporters who contributed to the collaboration. Elliot Chaparelli and Marina Koff. David Cruz, the editor of Norwood News, is also here. David, let's start with you. Can you tell me a little bit about gangs in the Bronx?
Sure. So essentially gangs are pretty much everywhere in this borough. You have gangs that are just divided up in two sections. You have crews, which are essentially low-level gangs, and then you have hardcore gangs, which are dealing with hard crime. We're talking drug running, prostitution, some kind of embezzlement crime, and usually they're the difference between the two is that crews also they don't really have the same organized structure as say like a gang. A gang is composed of a head, and then they have lieutenants, they have captains, and then they have their soldiers. And of course, there's three main gangs here in the Bronx. There's the Bloods, which started in the Bronx, the Crips, and then the Trinitarios, which also technically started within the Bronx borders, specifically Rikers Island, before just sort of spreading out to the borough. I can tell you that right now there's the anti-crime, anti-gang division, and they're only comprised of 22 cops who basically work with the 11th precincts throughout the borough, and they're trying their best to really sort of nip it in the bud. Some days there's some good times that they actually go ahead and really squash crime, but there's other times where gangs continue to sort of just dominate certain neighborhoods.
And how has the landscape of gangs in the Bronx changed over the years?
Well, I could tell you that those three main gangs have they've been here for as long since at least into the 90s. The Bloods are still here, the Crips are still here, and of course the Trinitarios are still here. In terms of the kinds of crime that they're running, a lot of the crimes these days they're running are computer-based crimes. Sometimes they're running ID theft kind of crimes these days, along with drug running. So they really turned a lot to cyber crime, and that's something that's new, that's been sort of proliferating within the borough themselves and within the gang networks themselves. And yeah, they've been pretty much sort of dealing with the same kind of violent crimes as well.
And how has Junior's death changed the way the community thinks about gang violence?
I could tell you, I'm not sure, it's sort of difficult to sort of determine its permanence, but I could tell you that a lot of people were sort of woken up by the fact that these gangs are pretty dangerous, especially when they went after a young kid like the 15-year-old Alessandro Guzman Feliz. They essentially saw that gangs are a major problem, and the only way to really squash them is through this community effort. In fact, Police Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill was crediting the communities for sort of for laying a lot of tips, a lot of information that proved really valuable to the police when they apprehended 14 suspects in the long run. So, to determine whether or not that kind of community involvement will translate to another neighborhood, it's sort of hard to tell. Unfortunately, you'd have to see another crime like that happen to determine whether or not this level of involvement will still hold.
And since covering this story, have you noticed any difference between how the NYPD is handling this case versus other less high-profile cases?
Well, I can tell you, I think the crux of this particular crime was the fact that he was 15 years old. I'm going to tell you, sometimes the police don't really care if it's gang members killing gang members. In this case, it was a case of mistaken identity. The kid was completely innocent, and also he was 15 years old. So for them to say that they're approaching it very differently, it's sort of hard to tell. They're relying a lot more on social media. Social media has kind of helped them, target who the right people are to suspect in being in a crime. So their involvement in terms of just sticking with social media has definitely increased, but sort of difficult to determine whether or not they're looking to apply their investigative practices to another kind of crime like that.
Thanks, David.
Sure.
I recently spoke with private detective Manuel Gomez. He was the person who managed to find and release the video of Junior's death. Gomez has been investigating the Trinitarios for 5 years, and he says the first step to bringing them down is to increase public awareness about the gang. Let's see the video. At first glance, Private Detective Manuel Gomez comes across as a modern-day James Bond. Gomez uses a pen that doubles as a recorder, self-defense weapon, and DNA collector. His reading glasses double as his video recorder. Gomez says he's different from other PIs because he only works to exonerate innocent people caught up in gang-related activity.
If you hire me, you have to be prepared for the truth. Because if I find out he's guilty, I'm going to know. And if he's innocent, I'm going to know.
One of Gomez's goals is to bring down the notorious Trinitario Gang. The Trinitarios are a Dominican-based gang which have an extremely large presence in the Bronx. In the borough, the gang is divided into 2 subsections known as the Southies and the Sunset Trinitarios. Both sections of the gang are at war with each other, and both are extremely violent. Gomez says that machetes are their weapon of choice.
Their motto is, give me a knife because it never runs out of bullets. A gun you could shoot 6, 7 times and it's no good, but a knife you can stab all day long.
Gomez says it's in parks like these that the Trinitario gang members hang out, meet, and target their enemies. He says it's not just kids going after other kids. Gomez says he himself has been targeted by some of the gang's leaders. Manuel Gomez was the person who released the eyewitness video of Guzman Feliz's murder to the media. The video went viral, garnering millions of views online and sparking the Justice for Junior hashtag. Gomez says he wanted the video to prompt a sense of urgency in the NYPD and the Bronx DA's office to investigate the Trinitarios.
We need to eliminate them off the street. And it's not about just people, calling 911. People need to be involved. We need to really write down what we see and make it safer. If they realize that they have nowhere to hide, the gang will disband.
Gomez says he will continue to go after the gang until the community is safer. He says as long as they commit crimes, he will be right there trying to stop them. For BronxNet, Julia Rist. It's not just private detectives or state and city law enforcement agencies that are trying to eliminate gang violence. Reporter Elliot Chaparelli took a look at another organization that's undertaking this issue. These people are called violence interrupters. Elliot, can you explain exactly what a violence interrupter is?
Yeah, so a violence interrupter is a person who's often a former gang member who has some former gang affiliation, who works within their own community to stop gang violence before it happens. So they do this by walking around, canvassing neighborhoods, talking to young people, talking to current gang members, and talking to people who could potentially end up in a gang about their past experience. I know the people I interviewed had past experience in jail and in prison, and they used that to talk about how they've changed their lives. At Release the Grip, they actually use the term credible messenger because of how important it is to have a role in the community that these violence interrupters are trying to impact. So they walk around and, like I said, meet with people and just really try to diffuse violent situations before it comes to somebody getting hurt or killed.
And how do violence interrupters work to help bring down crime in their neighborhood?
So in Morrisania, which is in the South Bronx, Release the Grip is working to curb violence with their experience And it used to be a very violent area, and through the office space where they've opened up to bring kids and to bring young people, they've just kept people off the street. And then they've also been implementing programs. So they had a trick-or-treating program at a local nursing home for kids. They were planning a Christmas party when I was there. So they're just giving alternative options to hanging out on a street corner.
That sounds great, Elliot. Let's take a look at your story.
For Freddie Charles Jr., credibility is key. He's an outreach worker for the Cure Violence initiative called Release the Grip in Morrisania, a section of the South Bronx. He refers to himself and his colleagues as credible messengers. They use this term because they are members of the community in which they work and used to be a part of the problem they now try to solve. A problem Charles says can be addressed by bringing the community together.
Like a lot of kids can't leave a particular block that they live on. You know, they can only go from corner to corner. They can't really go to no other block. So it's tragic.
Charles says this is because of the gangs that divide the neighborhood. He doesn't see his job as a regular 9 to 5.
I think the kids just need to know that someone's there for them. You know, at 2, 3 in the morning, they get arrested, they can call me and I'll call the lawyers.
Ariane Punter is the program director for Release the Grip. On October 10th, a shooting occurred 1 block from her office. Before that, the area of Morrisania that she oversees had gone 146 days without a shooting. That's a big difference from 4 years ago when the office opened. At that time, Punter says they were seeing high levels of violence and almost daily shootings.
So the trend is good because it was probably every day. It was probably every weekend. So the presence of credible messengers in community like these really makes a difference.
The Release the Grip program that has changed Morrisania will soon be implemented in Belmont, where Lissandro Jr. Guzman Feliz was killed. I'm Elliot Chaparelli, BronxNet.
Marina, your story focused on gangs in schools. Can you tell me a little bit about how gangs use schools to recruit new members?
Yeah, so the main thing is that we can't think about gangs as this kind of outside force coming into schools and actively recruiting new members, because that's not really the case. In schools where gang violence and gang activity is most prevalent, the kids are coming from communities where the gangs are also pretty prevalent. And so obviously these kids are coming from these communities into their schools. They bring their worlds with them. So a lot of kids in schools, they either know people, know older friends who are involved in gangs, or maybe family members, older siblings. They already have that contact that way. So it's not really about gangs as this outside force coming in, but it's really that the gangs are already in schools. That being said, the way that from inside the school it operates is that kind of like any other power structure in a school. If you have this popular group, the group that's in power, and other kids want to be like that, or they want what a gang can offer them. So if, say, kids being bullied, they want kind of safety or sense of protection, they can look towards a gang for that. If they maybe don't have that many friends and they want kind of a built-in community, they can look to a gang for that. And a big thing with that is kind of the glamorization of the culture. Like these kids will see gangs posting on social media, Instagram, pictures all together, and they have this community and they're wearing paraphernalia, different colors, and they are drawn to that. So that's really how inside of school it operates, how gangs are keeping their numbers up. It's really kind of kids that are drawn to the gangs.
Thanks, Marina.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at your story where you spoke to several advocates who are working to bring down gang prevention from the classroom.
The presence of gangs and crews on the streets of New York is nothing new. An integral part of keeping that power is by new recruitment. One way that they do this is by infiltrating schools. Today, I'm speaking with Kareem Nelson, who was once part of the problem, is now trying to be part of the solution.
Kareem Nelson took me to a playground in Sugar Hill where he grew up and where he also got involved in what he calls the street life. Nelson began participating in gang-like groups when he was just 12 years old. Eventually, he began selling drugs and engaging in gun violence. A gunshot wound paralyzed Nelson, but that wasn't enough to get him off the streets. He says that he finally decided to change after being in a situation where he had to beg for his life. Now, Nelson visits schools to teach kids strategies and techniques to avoid violent situations.
Ultimately, if you love yourself, you don't have to join the gang. Ultimately, if you have a high self-esteem, you don't have to join the gang. If you know how to resolve your conflicts, you don't have to join the gang. If you know how to think for yourself, you don't have to join the gang.
Saray King, a 15-year-old who met Nelson at a community-organized basketball clinic, says it's because of Nelson's mentorship that he's on the right track.
I'm not gonna say I was on the streets, but I was getting in trouble and stuff, and he kept telling me he kept being on my back and saying, get out the streets and play ball.
I spoke on the phone with Ron Barrett, or Cook as he is known by kids, on how important it is for reformed gang members to promote a violence-free culture. Barrett says gangs don't have to do much to keep their numbers up. Kids are drawn to gangs not just for what he says is a sense of protection and belonging, but to the romanticized culture. Gang colors and accessories, social media posts, and the music industry encourage kids to seek out gangs in their schools. Barrett says they look up to whoever's in power.
So a lot of kids feel to fit in, to get in, they're going to have to join the power group. And if that power group happens to be a Crip set, a Blood set, or a hybrid set, then these kids gravitate towards that because that sense of protection is very, very big, especially in an urban environment.
Barrett wants schools to practice zero-tolerance policies and to offer alternative activities and positive diversions, such as after-school activities. Both Cook and Nelson agree that schools can play a role in keeping kids off the streets. Reporting for BronxNet, I'm Marina Koff.
For Elliot and Marina, both your stories looked at ways former gang members are trying to steer kids away from gangs. From your reporting, how can a former gang member provide extra insight to a person who's thinking about joining a gang?
Yeah, so as you saw in my piece, I spoke to Kareem Nelson, who's the founder of Wheelchairs Against Guns, and he says that he's the best person to steer kids away because he is those kids. He knows the circumstances that they're coming from, and he can connect with them on that level. So he goes into schools, and he goes in because he wants to provide kids with the skills and the tools that he didn't have growing up, and that he says if he had those, then maybe he wouldn't have turned to what he calls the street life. So he goes in and he wants to teach those kids critical thinking skills, conflict resolution strategies, and he wants to build self-respect. And so because he didn't have those things, he believes that's why he turned to the streets. And so because he has that understanding, he's able to really get through the kids. Also, a big part of it is that the kids can see themselves in him because he knows what they're going through, and they may come from similar backgrounds, and that's why he is able to get through to them.
Yeah, like Marina said, both of the men I talked to had been in these kids and these young people that they were working with shoes not very long ago, and they were also from the area, Morrisania, where they were working, and they were using their place in that community to get through to people, and they kept telling me how important their credibility was in the community and how important their place in the community was, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to get through to people. And that credibility not only comes from that place in the community, but it also comes from the actual experience they've had with gangs and with prison and with the area. So one of the guys I talked to said he basically got in to Release the Grip through somebody he knew from prison. And he was on a better track getting out, and now he's trying to pass that on to other people. And then another person I talked to, while we were walking around, she stopped us and she was like, "You guys are finally getting the credit you deserve. Thank you so much for the work you do in this community." And she saw me, she goes, "These guys are going to get my son a job. These guys are helping my son out so much." And you saw her hugging Freddie Charles Jr. in the piece.
Yeah, that sounds great. Another story we focused on is how bodega owners are being trained to prevent gang violence. Various lawmakers are introducing legislation that would focus on helping bodega owners call the police faster and training bodega staff on how to respond to a violent incident. This comes after it was caught on video of Junior being dragged out of a bodega by members of a gang and being stabbed repeatedly. Many people criticize the bodega owner for their lack of response. David, after Junior's death, what would you say is the consensus among the public about the bodega owner's role?
Well, if you're specifically talking about, you're talking about the Lisandro Feliz killing? Well, I mean, the guy, the bodega owner, Modesto Cruz, was essentially a pariah within his community. A lot of the consensus from the community was that he could have done something to have prevented the death, although he spoke with several media outlets saying that he'd done all he could in terms of trying to stop this incident from happening. He said that it was 5 men with machetes versus 2 people with nothing, and so they decided he made the decision of pushing Lisandro out of the store for his own safety. Police Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill came out and said that that is not a crime, although he is sort of paying the price in the court of public opinion that he could have done something. And this sort of has gotten a lot of bodega owners to sort of speak up and say, hey, listen, if you want us to help, you have to help us. And so they've asked Councilman Fernando Cabrera to help pass legislation that would install panic buttons inside the bodega stores to sort of fast track a response from the police. That's one piece of legislation. The other one is Assemblyman Luis Sepulveda. He already introduced a bill that would create a safe haven for minors, those under the age of 18, to go into a store and be protected by a bodega owner. Bodega owner would simply have to lock the door and call the police. That's sort of a mandate that is pending right now in the state legislature.
And what kind of impact do you think this legislation will have on the community?
Well, I think they would probably find some kind of relief knowing that, sometimes crime can happen at any moment. Bodegas are open, sometimes they're open 24 hours a day, so this would help sort of keep them or sort of feel this sense of safety when it comes to having their kids being protected. So it may very well be received. Obviously, it depends on whether or not Governor Andrew Cuomo will sign this legislation, because it would not only apply, well, I guess it probably just applied to the city, but that is still tough to determine. Session won't be in until another month.
Yeah. Let's turn our attention to how gangs use social media. David, you contributed to an article about how the police are keeping track about who's in a gang through social media. Can you tell me a little bit about Operation Crew Cut, first of all?
Sure. So Operation Crew Cut started in 2012. It started by the then police commissioner Ray Kelly under Mayor Mike Bloomberg, and it essentially would have created a database that would place who they believe were known gang members. Inside this database, it would be easier for them to track. It'd be easier for them to see who they were affiliated with, on the hopes of actually creating creating faster arrests and trying to at least identify potential troublemakers. It had success in the beginning. It looks like crime or homicides within that age bracket of those who are part of a gang, those between the ages of 18 and 25, had dropped significantly a year after it was implemented, although it looks like it's sort of mutated into something completely different. So that's where it is. It's still an ongoing. It was carried over by Police Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill, so it looks like there's some efficacy to the initiative.
And how does a person find themselves on the database?
So usually it's just whether or not they're posing with gang members, they're throwing up a gang sign, they're talking about their crimes on social media. A lot of this is driven by social media. They have detectives who essentially look at social media feeds of known gang members, and then they take a look at who they're associating with, who their friends are on social media, and they track them. And they're essentially just looking for those warning signs. And sometimes there are unintended consequences to this kind of surveillance. But that's usually what happens when the police are kind of just tracking folks who are potential gang members.
And can you speak a little bit about the controversy that surrounds the database?
So sometimes you may associate with gang members, you may be a friend with a gang member, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a gang member. And so sometimes the police may inadvertently put you on the list. And so that makes you a target, especially when it comes to, say, you've committed a crime that has nothing to do with a gang. Prosecutors will go out and say, hey, listen, this person is on the gang database. He should get a stiffer penalty. And so that can cause a downward spiral. And also, it turns out there are more, I think 98% of those who are on the list are black and brown. They're minority, and obviously this is not a good sign for the NYPD. It looks like they're just simply targeting minorities. And so, there have been calls since the beginning of the summer to just try and get to essentially just have better standards when it comes to actually being placed on this list, because there's really no criteria. It's sort of, if a detective feels that that person is associated with gang members, it may lead to them being placed on the list. So it can be really, really arbitrary.
And from your reporting, was there anything that surprised you about how police track people through social media?
Really, that there's kind of no rhyme or reason. The reporter, Shelby Daniels, spoke to a gentleman who essentially said that tracking this is not necessarily a good thing, especially for young people, because young people are finding their identity. So sometimes they may do things that are that may be unwise. And so they're sort of paying the price for their own level of, adolescence. They're trying to find themselves, and so sometimes they find themselves in a bad place, and they are accidentally placed on the list as a result of that. And so this gentleman that Shelby spoke to said that list in and of itself should be abolished. It's not smart.
And this is a question for all of you. What do you think your biggest takeaway from your reporting has been?
So my biggest takeaway is that, first of all, Release the Grip, the people who interviewed, they have funding to open a new office in Belmont where Junior was killed, like I said in the video, and they're running into problems staffing the office and finding space for the office. And I think my biggest takeaway is just hoping that communities will be really receptive to programs like these, because they have really made an impact in Morrisania and then in the other areas where these violence interrupter programs are happening.
Yeah, for me, my biggest takeaway is how important it is to get to kids while they're young and while they're in school, because it's very hard once they go down the wrong path to turn that around. Like Kareem said, he was shot and paralyzed in his early 20s, and he was still living the street life. He was still on the street selling drugs and engaging in violent activities because he didn't know anything else. And so I think it's so important to show kids that there is something else. It's easier said than done, but kind of exposing kids to different opportunities is what I understand is the most important thing that you can do.
For me, this is just more speaking about the project itself. I feel like there's no one else doing this kind of work within Bronx media, so it's sort of a tip of the hat to BronxNet and WFUV, specifically the names who are not on the bylines, George Podarky, Michael Maxnavi, and Marissa White for having taken on this project. It's very timely, given the fact that this murder of Lysandra Guzman Feliz still sort of is impacting this borough, and it's a good testament to the kind of work that they want to bring to their audiences. So I'd just sort of be remiss if I didn't mention them.
Yes, thank you. And that's all the time we have for Bronx Connections, a special collaboration between public radio station WFUV, the Norwood News, and BronxNet on the Bronx gang impact. I want to thank David Cruz, Elliot Chaparelli, Marina Koff. I'm Julia Rist. Thanks for being with us.